Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
So we are in the end stage of the election season. You may have noticed, you might have want to discuss that, though not a lot of people came last Wednesday, but remember next Wednesday we're continuing our We Need to Talk session, and I can imagine that many people will have even more to say following next Tuesday's election. Not that we should expect a complete resolution come Tuesday or even Wednesday morning, because, well, things do definitely take time, and it's important to have that patience. But eventually, there will be a decision. Eventually, there will be some level of majority expressed through the framework of the U.S. System, and we will know who will be inaugurated come January. But when that happens, what does the other person need to do? What is the loser's responsibility in this place? Well, let me give you a little bit of an example from the Jewish story about similar debates, discussions with much passion and indeed some small degree of anger, and what can go wrong. So the story you might have heard, the story is the one of Tanur Shel Achnai. Although most people only study the first half of the story and miss the moral that we're going to focus on tonight. The short of the story, which will get us to our main point, is that there was a debate in the Beit HaMidrash 2,000 years ago, give or take, and the discussion was over whether a particular construction of oven was something that could be rendered ritually impure or not. Not exactly the kind of topic that you would imagine, well, eventual death from coming out of. But nonetheless, this argument got very heated, and there was one person, Rabbi Eliezer, who was opposed to the ruling of the rest of the community. The rest of the rabbinic community said, no, this oven is not kosher, more or less, and Rabbi Eliezer says it is. And after he had exhausted all of his arguments, after he had gone through all of the proper channels of debate, the majority still were voting against him regarding the status of this oven. And so he brought many miraculous proofs. He even seemed to be able to indicate that God was on his side, and yet the community refused to accept his opinion. And so at the very end, they take a vote. All those in favor of Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, and only Rabbi Eliezer puts his hand up. All those in favor of the opinion of the rest of the sages, and every other hand goes up. And so Rabbi Eliezer loses. And he is not a good sport about losing this debate and this discussion. Understand, this has practical implications. If people follow his opinion, despite the fact that the almost unanimous opinion of the rest of the sages was that this was not an appropriate type of oven, then that means people will be violating Jewish law. And no one will be able to know whether what they eat from someone else is kosher or not if there is a mixture of some people say yes and some people say no. There needed to be a community standard with regards to this oven and many other topics. This is why the rabbis debate and why they eventually vote in order to find a resolution. But Rabbi Eliezer did not concede. He did not accept the ruling of the majority, and for that, he was excommunicated. Now, excommunicated in English is a really clumsy word because it has a particular meaning within Catholicism, but it is not the same meaning. We are not denying someone their place in the afterlife. This is not about refusing to allow them to have the sacred, the sacraments themselves. It's more the literal excommunicate. You are pushed out of the community. That is to say, no one could get closer to Rabbi Eliezer than this. No one was allowed to talk to him. Nobody was allowed to do business with him. He was persona non grata within the community. Now, that's not great. It's not eternal damnation, but it's still no fun. But it may still seem harsh that they would do this to a great sage, somebody who was esteemed for his wisdom and is still lauded as being one of the finest sages we ever had, just because he he didn't accept the vote. And I mean, honestly, he thought he was right. He had, in his mind, proof from God that he was right. He was not going to concede, come what may. Well, eventually, in his own grief, in his own pain, in his feelings of humiliation, he would lead indirectly through his machinations, if you will, while blinded by this grief and anger, to the death of one of his colleagues, Rabban Gamliel. Eventually, Rabban Gamliel would succumb to problems that were instigated thanks to Rabbi Eliezer. It was that serious to him, and the effect was that serious. Now, it was indirect, so he wasn't a murderer and he wasn't guilty of a particular crime, but it did become a turning point. And eventually, he did concede. Eventually, he was reconciled with the community. Eventually, he did recognize that he had gone too far, and that by going too far in avoiding that concession, he had forced the community to go too far in excommunicating him in retaliation. So, we come back to the original question. Once things have been finally settled and done according to the proper procedures, and all the I's have been dotted, the T's have been crossed, we've minded our P's, we've minded our Q's, and we have a definite answer to who will be the next person in any of our political positions, what is the obligation of the other members of those political campaigns? To concede. To concede. It sounds like terrible. How can you give up? After all, we have laden this election season, maybe even more than last election season, which was even more than the previous one, which was even more than the previous one. We have laden it with existential values and angst. We have decided that this election will be the one to decide the fate of all of humanity for all of the rest of history. How could I possibly concede, even if I lose? Well, because there is the necessity of maintaining these United States. The last time there was a true unwillingness to accept the outcome of an election, we had a civil war. That was the start of the Civil War, was the election of Abraham Lincoln. He had done nothing. He had not even been inaugurated yet when the Civil War broke out back in 1860. It was the idea that someone like Lincoln could be elected that drove the southern states to demand their own secession in order to pursue their policy of slavery. And we are still dealing with the repercussions of that Civil War and all of its aftermath more than 150 years later. We do not need another incident such as that. We need to recognize that as the United States, we are stronger when we are united, and that the world needs us to be united. There was a conversation that someone asked me just recently about what we should be looking for in a candidate for the good of Israel. And I said, well, if you want a good American candidate for the good of Israel, then what you actually need to be looking for is not the candidate per se, but that we will eventually embrace the unity that our country needs. Because Israel is not served by a disunited United States. The rest of the world is not served by a disunited United States. There needs to be concession. There needs to be an actual attempt to bridge the gap between the different opinions within our country if we are going to remain a country. We see what happened in our ancient world. As I mentioned during my Rosh Hashanah speech, we have ancient wisdom. We have been there before. We have seen what happens by choosing different alternatives, most of them bad. We've gone down all of the dark roads that a civilization might possibly go down, and we should be telling others, this is a necessary component. When things have been done properly, when there is a resolution that is correct according to the rules of this country, then we need to have graciousness from the winner and graciousness from the person who loses. If we have that, then perhaps we can remember the gift that we enjoy, this freedom that we have, is not just because we lack the power to force someone else to concede to my will, but that we have this gift of freedom in order that we can show the world that it does not take authoritarianism, it does not take coercion in order to have a united and harmonious country. If we can't be an example to the world for that, well, I'm not sure what good we're going to be. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.